Bonjour à toutes et à tous. Hello everybody. Le ministre des Finances nous a mandatés pour mener une consultation des parties prenantes pour l'éventuelle création d'une monnaie numérique de banque centrale au Canada, que nous désignerons sous l'acronyme CDBC, pour Central Bank Digital Currency. Vanessa Fecteau, Perry Sutton, Kloski Mathurin et moi-même, en tant que membres de la direction de la politique du secteur financier du ministère des Finances, allons aujourd'hui analyser la perspective des banques commerciales ou banques à charte. Next slide. Mais avant de commencer, nous aimerions procéder rapidement à une reconnaissance des terres autochtones. Glendon College reconnaît sa présence sur le territoire traditionnel de nombreuses nations autochtones. La région a été prise en charge par la nation Anishinaabe, la confédération Haudenosaunee, les Hurons-Wendat et les Métis. Elle est aujourd'hui le lieu de résidence de nombreux peuples autochtones. Next slide. Une CDBC est une forme de monnaie numérique émise, contrôlée et réglementée par la Banque centrale. Elle a les mêmes fonctions qu'une monnaie traditionnelle. C'est un moyen de paiement, une réserve de valeur et une unité de compte. On distingue deux formes de CDBC. Les wholesale CDBCs sont exclusivement destinés aux institutions financières et sont utilisés pour les paiements et règlements interbancaires, nationaux et internationaux. Les retail CDBCs sont destinés au grand public et peuvent être utilisés comme moyen de paiement et comme réserve de valeur, comme une monnaie liquide. Plusieurs tendances récentes ont poussé le ministre des Finances à s'intéresser aux monnaies numériques. Premièrement, plusieurs États ont exploré la mise en place d'une CDBC ces dernières années. Les États émergents, et surtout la Chine, sont particulièrement en pointe, mais les pays industrialisés s'y intéressent de plus en plus. Selon la Banque des règlements internationaux, 86% des banques centrales travaillaient sur une CDBC en 2020 et 14% avaient déjà lancé des projets pilotes. La Banque du Canada mène elle-même des recherches depuis 2016. Deuxièmement, le développement des crypto-monnaies par des sociétés privées, telles que le Bitcoin ou le Diem, pose un défi au ministère des Finances. En effet, le fait que l'usage des crypto-monnaies ne soit pas réglementé peut mener à des comportements spéculatifs. Et les crypto-monnaies sont propices aux activités illégales telles que la fraude fiscale ou le blanchiment d'argent. Troisièmement, le fait que les Canadiens utilisent de plus en plus la monnaie liquide, de moins en moins la monnaie liquide, et que 2/3 des paiements se font aujourd'hui en ligne, rend le passage à une monnaie numérique envisageable. Enfin, les CDBC permettraient de lutter contre l'inflation et la perte de compétitivité des entreprises canadiennes. Next slide. Le développement des CDBC représente une opportunité pour le Canada en termes de compétitivité internationale, mais aussi un défi pour assurer la sécurité et la stabilité du système financier. Next slide. Divers acteurs sont concernés par la mise en place d'une CDBC. Cet ensemble comprend la Banque centrale, les banques commerciales et les opérateurs de cartes bancaires, les agences de régulation financière, les résidents canadiens, les petits commerces et les grandes entreprises, et des associations. Notre présentation, qui repose sur la perspective des banques commerciales, repose sur la consultation de l'Association des banques canadiennes, de l'Association Paiement Canada, du Mouvement des caisses Desjardins, des 5 plus grandes banques canadiennes, des exploitants de réseaux de cartes bancaires, des provinces et des territoires. Next slide. À première vue, les CDBC ont des avantages et des inconvénients. Pour ce qui est des avantages, les CDBC permettraient de faciliter les moyens de paiement et de rendre le système financier plus inclusif. Aussi, utiliser les monnaies virtuelles permettrait de réduire les coûts de transactions financières, qui représentent à peu près 3% de chaque paiement actuellement. Pour ce qui est des désavantages, il sera difficile de démocratiser l'utilisation des CDBC, surtout pour le Canada, qui a une population vieillissante et des communautés reculées sans accès à Internet. Les CDBC peuvent aussi poser un problème de respect de la vie privée. De plus, mettre en place une monnaie virtuelle demande des investissements importants dans les infrastructures pour le stockage et la protection des données, et ça se révèle coûteux en énergie, alors même que le Canada a des objectifs environnementaux à atteindre. Enfin, les CDBC pourraient déstabiliser le monde financier traditionnel en réduisant les ressources disponibles pour les banques commerciales. Je passe la parole à Kloski. Next slide.
Canada's bank commercial banks have shown a consistent track record in safeguarding the integrity and stability of the banking system. However, officials representing Canada's banking sector have expressed concern over the impact that a retail CBDC could have on the Bank of Canada's abilities to preserve the Canadian dollar's value and promote a safe and efficient financial system. Our team has identified 4 main considerations that are very important to Canadian commercial banks. The first is the current stability of the Canadian banking system. According to the World Economic Forum, Canadian banks are some of the most stable and well-regulated in the world, making them a model for other financial systems. And the Canadian dollar is one of the most stable and attractive currency in the world. That being said, taking a step towards implementing a CBDC risks a banking disintermediation crisis, which could impact the bank's ability to provide credit to clients and could lead to financial instability. The second consideration is efficiency. The payment system in Canada is efficient, innovative, and built on solid financial institutions. Canadians can use debit and credit card, electronic and mobile payment, and the system will continue to innovate. In fact, 84% Canadians report satisfaction with their digital payment method. Some claims have been made that a CBDC could make interbank payment cheaper and faster, particularly ones made across international borders. The Bank of Canada and Royal Bank have studied these issues, but neither study has provided conclusive proof. Therefore, significant progress of a CBDC over the current system is unclear. Another important consideration when dealing with currency is ensuring traceability and preventing illegal use of money. When it comes to security, banks are subject to federal regulation under the Proceed Crimes, Money Laundering, and the Terrorist Financing Act. They must collect information from clients and report suspicious transactions to FinTrack. Over the past decade, banks have spent $100 billion on technology dedicated to security measures. Even though a retail CBDC model information sharing could aid commercial banks to complying with security requirements, the progress might be limited and concern remains regarding privacy and money laundering for CBDCs. Finally, inclusiveness. One of the arguments for introducing a retail CBDC is to achieve financial inclusion by targeting groups not in the current banking system, such as homelessness and people living in remote communities. However, further studies are needed to support this argument. What is clear is that in current Canadian financial system, the current financial system is already one of the most accessible in the world. And according to the Government of Canada, approximately 97% of Canadians have an account with a financial institution. That being said, with so many important questions that remain unanswered, those within the commercial banking industry believe that the challenges associated with a CBDC outweigh the benefit. Next period with the policy options.
Now I'll delve into some of the policy options that our team has considered, the first being implementation of a wholesale CBDC. Several studies have shown that a wholesale CBDC may lead to faster and more efficient payments between financial institutions. The Bank of Canada currently operates the large value transfer system, which is used by commercial banks to settle large value transactions between banks and their customers.
Excuse me, could we change slides, please? Thank you.
Many believe that this system could be supplemented by a wholesale CBDC. The Bank of Canada and commercial banks have a symbiotic relationship as both parties rely on each other to maintain the stability of the Canadian banking system. With this in mind, the Bank of Canada undertook a project to explore the implementation of a wholesale CBDC in 2015 when it launched Project Jasper. These inquiries caused the Bank of Canada to conclude that there is currently a high level of uncertainty regarding the viability of CBDCs, which have yet to be implemented in a major Western economy, and that introducing a CBDC at this time could threaten the stability of the Canadian financial system, mainly due to heightened cybersecurity risks. The second option under consideration is the adoption of a wholesale and a retail CBDC. From a security standpoint, the risks of fraud, theft, and network failure carry more severe repercussions with retail CBDCs than they do for traditional currency. For instance, if a retail CBDC is widely used, a system failure could cause substantial interruptions to the financial system as a whole. Retail CBDCs would also require heavy investment in cybersecurity and system resilience mechanisms to be effective. In light of these facts, the World Economic Forum and Bank of International Settlements conclude that retail CBDCs may introduce more security and safety risks than they address. Our third and preferred option is the establishment of an Overwatch Committee. Although concerns about responding to the evolving financial landscape proactively by implementing a CBDC are legitimate, its implementation requires collaboration with stakeholders and careful consideration of the risks and benefits. For this reason, we propose the Department of Finance establish an Overwatch Committee consisting of representatives from key stakeholder groups. The purpose of the committee is to keep the minister up to date on the matter by performing three key tasks. First, it would engage both industry and non-industry stakeholders to coordinate efforts and share information on CBDCs. Second, it would enhance research that has already been conducted on the technical, economic, legal, and regulatory aspects of CBDCs, including their potential impact on monetary policy, financial stability, and consumer protection. Finally, the Overwatch Committee would submit an annual report to guide the minister on whether or not Canada should move towards implementation. The recommendations would be based not only on domestic and international conditions, but also on the infrastructural capacity of Canada's financial system. While this approach is largely in alignment with the Bank of Canada's plan, the BOC is an arm's length agency with a mandate that is independent of the Minister of Finance. The Overwatch Committee is a low-cost option that is in line with the current government's mandate. Therefore, the committee would go beyond the scope of the BOC by offering a whole-of-government approach to the issue that will necessitate engagement with non-industry stakeholders like consumer advocacy groups, provinces and territories, other government ministries and departments, commercial banks, regulators, and financial technology companies. Next slide, please. This risk matrix provides an overview of the benefits and drawbacks of each policy option. This evidently demonstrates that a committee is the most risk-averse course of action, which would not present a threat to the stability of the existing banking system. Next slide, please. So why should we go forward with this option? First, an Overwatch Committee would allow for better informed evidence-based decision-making. Second, it would foster collaboration and engagement between stakeholders and allow for important conversations to be had regarding the risks and rewards of CBDC implementation on a holistic level. Finally, by researching and monitoring domestic and international developments, the committee would be well positioned to advise the government on implementation of a CBDC should conditions call for it. Next slide, please. Now I will discuss the potential risks associated with our preferred course of action. The principal concern that we have identified with not moving to adopt a central bank digital currency is that Canada may find themselves at a competitive disadvantage compared to other developed nations in the realm of financial innovation. Some refer to this as losing the first mover advantage. If Canada does not adopt a CBDC, it may render the banking system less efficient than other nations, which could impact its competitiveness in global markets. For example, if other countries have faster and more efficient payment systems, Canadian businesses may face higher transaction costs and longer processing times. This could make them a less attractive option for international firms and consumers. Lastly, our team has accounted for the possibility that domestic actors may express frustration with the lack of progress on the development of a CBDC. We also recognize that recruitment of a range of experts representing a diversity of stakeholder perspectives could pose a challenge. So how do we mitigate these risks? While the notion of increasing efficiency and staying ahead of competitors is attractive, it could, as mentioned, also lead to a number of negative outcomes. Moreover, banks are investing more in financial technologies to develop innovative customer service solutions and make extant bank operations more efficient. For example, the real-time rail is a new payment system expected to go live in 2023 in Canada. This system will have the ability to reach more deposit accounts in Canada than any other system. When fully implemented, the real-time payment system will allow for instant payments 24 hours a day, 7 days per week. Despite alarm in some quarters over Canada being a laggard nation with respect to CBDC adoption, current literature does not support any meaningful first mover advantage associated with taking the lead. We also plan to be fully transparent with the general public, particularly those in favor of a more aggressive approach to CBDC adoption, by outlining the rationale behind our more deliberate strategy. The experts consulted for our committee will also be reminded of the public service impact of their participation in the committee, as well as options to participate on a part-time basis. Next slide, please.
So should the Canadian government decide to proceed with our plan, a strong communication strategy would be necessary to maintain strong stakeholder trust. In regards to commercial banks, there are 5 major stakeholders to keep in mind, notably shareholders, employers, creditors, business customers, and regulators. These stakeholders can further be divided into 2 groups: the external public, who tends to have limited economic knowledge, and the internal experts, who can manage more complex information on the subject. To best communicate the governmental action, we are suggesting 2 tailored communication strategies. One for the public, which will be a small campaign aimed to comfort Canadians in regards to Canada's approach, while the other communication strategy, targeted to field experts, will be more robust, given their larger participatory role in the Overwatch Committee. More specifically, our communication approach identifies 3 integral parts to ensure clear and transparent lines of communication between the stakeholders and the government. Those are reach, messaging, and engagement, which in turn should result in stakeholders who are more aware, knowledgeable, and have an improved attitude towards the government. Ultimately, the aim of this strategy is to promote higher levels of trust in government, fostering the ideal grounds to implement CBDCs if the proper moment arises. Next slide, please. Now, I will give you an overview of this 3-part strategy. Firstly, industry experts will be reached through private events, conferences, and meetings, since their needs and interests are more technical, while the general population should be reached through social media, speeches, and interviews, meeting their needs for a widespread but less technical messaging. Second, the messaging targeted to industry experts will focus on the government's commitment to transparent collaboration and to keeping both private and public stakeholders' best interests in mind. Whereas the key messages for the general population will focus on the government's commitment to safekeeping Canadians' privacy and their economy. Finally, to engage industry experts, the government should commit to incentivizing and facilitating 2-way communication, which monitors attitudes and industry updates. Whereas it is recommended that the government conducts focus groups and surveys to monitor attitudes of the general population. All in all, this communication strategy hopes to result in stakeholders that are aware, knowledgeable, and trusting of their government's cautious approach in regards issuing a CBDC. Trust, which could ultimately facilitate implementation of a CBDC should the need arise. Next slide.
Donc, pour conclure, nous ne recommandons pas la mise en place d'une CDBC à court et moyen terme, car les risques surpassent les bénéfices potentiels. Comme nous l'avons vu, le système financier canadien affiche de bons résultats. Il est efficace, sécurisé, inclusif, et la crise de 2008 a démontré sa stabilité. La mise en place d'une CDBC pourrait gravement déstabiliser ce système en réduisant les ressources à disposition des banques, sans apporter de progrès significatifs en termes de compétitivité et d'inclusion. Toutefois, les CDBC représentent une technologie d'avenir et elles pourraient devenir indispensables à la compétitivité du Canada. Nous pensons que le ministère des Finances doit rester vigilant et se préparer à l'implémentation d'une CDBC si le besoin s'en fait sentir. C'est pourquoi nous recommandons la mise en place d'un groupe de travail au sein du ministère chargé d'effectuer la veille sur les CDBC et de consulter régulièrement les parties prenantes. Cette décision est peu risquée et apporte de nombreux bénéfices. Elle permettrait d'acquérir de meilleures connaissances des CDBC avec une perspective plus large que ce que fait la Banque centrale. Elle permettrait aussi de construire un lien de confiance durable avec les acteurs du secteur. Thank you very much for your attention. We are now open to questions in French or in English.
D'abord, au nom de mes homologues, j'aimerais faire un petit merci à vos présentations. Le groupe a beaucoup de travail à faire et cette présentation est très intéressante. J'aimerais commencer par une question. La question, c'est essentiellement, je pense que cette recommandation est très conservateur. C'est une question que les autres, beaucoup de groupes qui sont ici d'abord nous aimerait procéder rapidement avec ce type d'initiative, mais vous avez les conseils qui n'est pas d'accord avec ce type d'action. Et j'aimerais peut-être demander plus pourquoi vous avez pris cette conclusion.
Donc, on a décidé de prendre la décision, effectivement, de ne pas avancer rapidement vers des CDBC. D'abord parce que nous avons collecté la perspective des banques commerciales. Et donc, en les consultant, nous nous sommes rendus compte que le système bancaire canadien actuel est finalement déjà très stable, très efficace et très inclusif. Et donc, on a pu en déduire que finalement, mettre en place des monnaies virtuelles n'apporterait pas de progrès significatifs par rapport au système actuel, alors que de nombreux risques y sont encore attachés. Donc, on préférerait finalement attendre un peu et voir peut-être aussi ce qui se passe dans les autres pays qui mettent des CDBC.
Merci beaucoup. Peut-être on pourrait commencer avec Ron, qui travaille à banque.
Merci beaucoup. So my first question is, do you have any advice for this Overwatch committee in terms of what they should be looking for? In particular, I'd ask, quelles conditions devraient être réunies pour que vous puissiez soutenir l'interruption d'une CBDC?
I can address I didn't quite catch the second part of the question. I can address the first part. The goal for the Overwatch Committee would be to have a broader mandate than Bank of Canada. So the advice would be to engage a broader range of stakeholders. So for example, consumer advocacy groups. We'd like to interface with other ministries. So for example, the Ministry of Rural Economic Development, the Ministry of Innovation, Science and Industry, ministers or ministries of finance at the provincial level as well. And then groups that work with vulnerable communities who, just studying the impact essentially of a CBDC on those groups as well. So it's just to consult as broad a range of stakeholders as possible. As to the second half of the question, I'm not sure if Matisse caught that. He might be able to address that.
I'm really sorry. What was the second part of the question?
You're on mute, Ron.
The second part of the question was, what are the conditions that the Overwatch Committee should be looking for that would lead them to believe that the time may be coming to introduce a CBDC?
First, seeing on what other countries are doing and seeing if it works, because for the moment, even though many other countries are working on it, nothing has been clearly set. Second would be looking exactly at if the lack of CDBC in Canada impacts a lot its competitiveness. That, I think, is an important matter. So the Overwatch Committee would be looking at competitiveness matters for Canadian financial institutions and Canadian companies. And well, if it really becomes a problem, yes, it would maybe move forwards to implementing a CDBC.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm going to ask my two colleagues here to actually take those two issues and probe a little bit. So Shirley, maybe if you could ask a little bit about how not moving forward as quickly as the minister might potentially expect deal with maybe competitiveness issues. And then Ellen, I'd like you, after Shirley's done and the answers provided, I'd like you to maybe talk about the communication challenges that this proposal would bring forward, because oversight committees and committees they're not necessarily the most positive thing right now in the Canadian context. So Shirley.
Yeah, thanks, Tacky. One thing that the team mentioned within the presentation was that they didn't see a first mover advantage. So I would be curious, on why the team kind of took this position. And I guess further, just in terms of maybe elaborate a little bit on the risk that you considered in not moving forward in terms of maintaining our competitive advantage.
I think that stems largely from the fact that, Canada is a middle income nation. When you look around at other developed economies, none of them have adopted a CBDC, and it's been studied extensively by other countries that are more comparable to Canada, like Denmark, for example, who have come to a similar conclusion, and larger economies like the United States. No developed nation has adopted this. I think it is important to consider the risks involved. So for Canada to then move ahead of a larger economy like the United States and adopt this, I think, especially considering some of the risks involved, I think it might be a little premature. And I think that's why our approach involves monitoring and involves, a vigilant approach. This is something that we'll be watching closely to make sure that we don't fall behind in any meaningful way if the dynamic changes globally. To us, the evidence just doesn't support Canada moving ahead of some of these other developed nations who have not adopted it.
Thank you, Perry. Alan.
And adding to that, it's that we
absolutely.
need to understand the risk of the infrastructure for a retail or wholesale CBDC, how that will impact in the bank. Because at the end, that can impact the lending for the bank, credit creation, and also deposit outflow, which can affect the economy, and that will go directly for a financial instability. And also all the benefit that we are trying to understand in introducing a retail CBDC, the current system is already working on them, like inclusiveness and for the security. So if we want to move forward implementing the CBDC, we would like to understand the infrastructure of it and how all the claims that it's made that will help the system are very true. And that's why we think that the committee also should still monitoring and also to have a clear answer before going forward and implementing it.
Thank you. Alan.
Thanks so much. Thanks for the presentation, an interesting perspective. Often when we see these sorts of initiatives, the perception of the public is more about stalling tactic than building trust. How would you kind of frame this? What can you give a little bit more detail about what you're asking this group to do that would warrant kind of annual reports, which is a very tight turnaround for what seems like maybe a large and very diverse group to kind of capture a single recommendation for the minister on an annual basis. So it would be helpful for us if you could talk a little bit more in detail about the charge to this group and how you would frame that publicly so as not to just appear like a stalling tactic.
So overall, from our research, there seems to be multiple opinions within the public when it comes to the implementation of CBDCs. And there's no evidence to show that the majority of Canadians are actually for us moving forward. So we think that the best approach is to start introducing the idea of CBDCs to Canadians in a way that is slow, that demonstrates that we're really taking our time to monitor the situation, as has been mentioned, to investigate and not to just jump into something that we don't know much about. There's also a huge issue of regulation, which throughout all of technology, this has been a big concern for Canadians, that it hasn't been regulated sufficiently, that the regulation always comes after the implementation. So this is a step forward into showing Canadians that we're dedicated to make progress in regards to what we have done in the past, and that we are keeping an eye on the market their financial and economic security and their privacy is our first concern. And so just framing it in that way, we think will really maintain that trust from Canadians.
Merci beaucoup pour cette présentation.